clicking of my thumbs. Something wicked this way comes.
When I was little, probably 2 or 3, when my mum and I were visiting my grandpa, his home we used to call the Red House. This is before he moved to Jones Creek. It's located in Verda, Kentucky. There are 2 churches there. Before you reach the second one, there's a turnoff to the left. At the time, I wasn't able to crawl on my knees. Whenever I needed to get somewhere, I would roll. There's a staircase to the right with no railing when you walk in. I must have gotten curious as to what was up there. This is where this story begins to differ. My mum says that she didn't know where I was at and started looking. It scared the dickens out of her. Until she came to the conclusion that I was up said stairs. Then she sees me, holding someone's hand. Here's my point of view. Forgive me if I leave stuff out. Back up to where my mum is looking for me, and after getting up the stairs, I have 3 uncles, 2 brothers on my grandma's side. One lives here in Kentucky, the other lives in North Carolina. At the upper level of the house, there's the room of my 3rd uncle, whose name was Keith, a brother on my mother's side. He passed 3 years ago, right before Christmas. I used to see him playing some kind of fighting game on the SNES, asking me if I wanted to join in. After I said yes, he teaches me the controls. Later on I managed to beat, I think, either 3 or 4 levels. That's when we both heard my mum calling out my name. I remember standing there holding his hand. I've wanted to share my experiences with the paranormal for a long time. It's extensive, as all of the females in my family are spiritually gifted. My grandmother had an angel visit her when she was in her late 30s, saying it was her time. She pleaded with him, saying that all she wanted was to raise her last child, my Aunt Kay, who was only 3 at the time. Almost as soon as my aunt turned 18, my grandmother died in her kitchen with no warning or known cause. As for my own personal experiences, I've had numerous things happen, and most involved human spirits. My son, who is almost 19 years old, battled cancer as a toddler. We made numerous trips back and forth to the hospital for his extensive treatment. On one trip home, something felt very different. I was in my infant son's nursery, putting him to bed for the night, when I sensed a very obvious presence standing behind me. I turned around but saw no one. It was after that my 5-year-old daughter started complaining that a man was standing in her doorway at night, just watching her. She mentioned it on several occasions. One day, I was in the living room cleaning, and I bent down to get my vacuum ready. When I raised back up, I saw a man standing next to me, wearing a red and black flannel shirt and blue jeans. He was there for a split second, but he looked solid. Several years later, we had moved from the apartment that the previous experience happened in, but we continued to have creepy things happen. One that truly stands out in my memory was witnessed by myself, my then husband, and 2 of our children. We had just arrived home from church, and we all saw a blonde-headed boy, maybe 10 years old, walk through the living room and into the bathroom. We saw him turn the light on and close the door. Assuming it was one of our sons, we waited a bit. We suddenly realized that the bathroom light was no longer shining from beneath the closed door, so I went to check. No one was in the bathroom, and we had kept our eyes on the door because we all needed our turn to wash up. No one exited the bathroom after we saw the boy go inside. The final experience I'll share with you involves the last place we lived. It was a badly run trailer park, and none of us liked it. There was an empty trailer behind our home, and my kids, now teenagers, were curious to check it out. They visited it a couple of times, bringing a poster and an unusable microwave from it into our home. Shortly thereafter, my daughter started hearing a voice coming from the direction of the kitchen where the microwave was. One evening, I was sitting in our living room, and I was just turned to talk to my then 16-year-old son. He was standing in the dining room, and as we talked, I saw a young man coming down the hallway towards us. He had long, blonde hair and was wearing a white t-shirt and ripped jeans. He was looking right at me, and the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. Then, he just vanished in front of me. Several days later, I was standing in my daughter's room talking with her. The back door was just outside her bedroom door. I glanced behind me and saw the exact same young man. He was staring at me again with the same forlorn expression. I'm Christian, and I decided to pray for his spirit to find peace. After that incident, I never saw him again, and the voices from the microwave stopped. We found out shortly thereafter that a murder had been committed in the trailer behind us. I feel like his sadness came from being betrayed by someone he trusted. I still think about him, and I hope his spirit has found peace with God. I'm not a religious person, but I do believe that there are beings that exist outside of our physical existence. Although I have been back and forth in my belief that there is a benevolent God, every time that I've been in the grasps of an evil presence, I find that calling upon the Lord's name would always make the evil presence disappear. I haven't had very many supernatural experiences in my life, but when they do happen, I don't forget them. A few years ago, my family moved to a fairly new house. At the time, I was in college, so would only visit them during breaks, but during the summer of 2015, I stayed with them for about 2.5 months. Since I didn't have a car and my mum was essentially always at work, my younger siblings and I were stuck in the house. I tried to make the best of it though, by finding a movie for us to watch almost every night, most of them being horror. I'd say that everything was fine for the first few weeks that I was there, but then things started to get slightly weird. One night, while I was scrolling through social media, I heard my stepdad come back from work and shuffle around the kitchen while he was on the phone. I walked downstairs to greet him and he wasn't there. I stood in the living room, dumbfounded. I mean, where was he? I just heard him on the phone. A few minutes later, I hear the door unlocking, only to see my stepdad walking in. "Were you inside a few minutes ago?" I asked. "No, I just got in," he says. "Did you walk in and then walk out?" He shakes his head, no. I was so confused. My stepdad is an alcoholic and comes home either tipsy or drunk most nights. So I figured maybe he had a few drinks and just forgot that he was just in the house. Looking back, he seemed pretty sober and coherent that night. Just a few days after the incident, it happened again. I heard what sounded like my mum and sister coming back from the grocery store. I could literally hear their voices. I went downstairs to help them out, and once again, they weren't there. I started to question whether I was becoming detached from reality or not. I've never heard voices before. I shared this with my sister, who expressed to me that she too was experiencing something similar. She said that there have been times where she thought she heard me or a younger brother talking, only for us to not even be there. The thought that something was imitating my voice made me feel very uneasy. I've heard stories before of people thinking they heard a family member or friend calling their name. I've been told that in those instances, it is a demon who is looking for an invitation. But what exactly is the purpose of imitating a conversation? The weirdest moment I experienced in that house happened one night as I was falling asleep. I was in this half asleep, half awake state, kind of like an in-between where I would find myself drifting. Suddenly, I begin to hear a man shouting in my ear. I don't remember what it said, but I woke up fully expecting to see a person in my room, but there was no one. After that night, I spent a few days looking up what could be the cause of this. I stumbled upon a Christian forum where I talked about this specific experience and was told that it was for sure a demon trying to mess with me. On the other hand, I found websites that described this event as a normal, physiological occurrence. Although I do believe that many things can have scientific reasoning, I also believe that sometimes there are otherworldly things at play. The most notable incident happened the night before I was supposed to move out of my dorm. As I slept on my side, it felt like I was being pushed, like something was trying to roll me onto my stomach. But because I knew it wasn't an actual person, I didn't care and continued to sleep. The morning after, as my family was helping me pack up, I started to feel this burning sensation below my left shoulder. I asked my sister to take a look, and she told me there were 3 long scratch marks. I thought maybe I'd scratched myself while unconscious, but given that there were 3 marks, and I felt myself being pushed, I knew it was from something that did not mean well. In a separate experience I fell asleep on the couch in my family's newest house, only to find myself in that dreadful state of not being able to move. Some people say that sleep paralysis feels like someone is pushing you down. For me, it feels like a vibration all throughout my body, almost as if whatever it is, it's made up of some buzzing vibrational energy. I tried so hard to open my eyes, to speak, to move, until I finally found the strength to say Jesus. Just as I said it, I could hear ice from the dispenser in the kitchen drop loudly, and I was able to open my eyes. Instead of feeling afraid, something told me that the sound of the ice falling symbolized the spirit being ripped out of the house. I have my theories as to why these things happen, but I'm interested to hear from others as to what they think is the reason for these eerie events. I had my first paranormal experience when I was 5. That's a story for another day. But when I moved in with my mum, it got worse. All the women on my mum's side of the family have, let's say, an ability most don't have. But my mum has always had these experiences. I would occasionally see things, and so did my 3 sisters. It wasn't something that really bothered us, so I guess we were used to weird things happening to us, especially if you were around my mother. Later, we would, or at least I would, notice that it was following her. I can never remember living anywhere with her that something wasn't there, and I call it because I don't know what it was and still don't to this day. I really don't know how to describe it. It just is. Well, in 1992 we lived in this small blue house. This was the first actual house we would ever live in. Now, I grew up very poor, so we didn't live in the best of places. Remember I said in the beginning of this email that my sister and I were used to weird things happening to us? But this would be the first time I'd actually be terrified. That year, it froze. When I say that, I mean everything was frozen, which is unusual for Pasadena, Texas. Getting snow or even freezing temperatures just doesn't happen this far south. It's rare, and when we do, we remember it, especially since with the slightest whiff of cold and a Texas teenager knows, the schools close. That whole month, it seemed like everything creepy wanted to happen. From cabinets slamming, lights turning off and on, the smell of death for no reason, and just your normal creepy things we were used to. It just seemed like all the activity was amplified. Not sure why I remember it happening like a build-up, as if it was angrier than usual. I don't know. Even my sister Sabrina remembers it that way. Well, after weeks of this, right before the school holiday break, it froze, so we got an extra week off school, making 3 full weeks at home. One night my mum was at work, stepfather was in jail, 2 older sisters at friends' homes spending the night. This left me and my sister Sabrina alone for a few hours until my mum got off work. We go roller skating so we don't spend too much time inside the house. We know it's scary, so we leave. After a few hours, we have to go home. Well, we were not prepared for what we walked into smelling and seeing. As soon as we walked inside, the smell of 2-week-old roadkill all of a sudden hit us. Not only that, but it's very cold inside, like freezing cold. The smell is intense, to put it lightly. Almost like thick air. Couldn't breathe type thick. Sabrina and I giggle, make a joke about ghost farts and such to ease the creepiness. This works for maybe a total of 2 minutes. Shortly thereafter said fart jokes, the crack in the kitchen flooring started wiggling. We both could hear it, but didn't pay attention to it. Again, we were used to this stuff. I got this feeling of dread and fear. I was shaking and had no clue why. But I also had this feeling like I needed to look at the flooring. I wish I hadn't, but 12-year-old me does. There were maggots coming up out of the flooring. I mean, as if something was dead right there. As if a piece of roadkill was under the flooring that had peeled back. I'm staring at the maggots, wondering where they came from. I looked over at my sister and tell her about what I'm seeing, and she looks too. Her and I are now seeing these maggots, seemingly from nowhere, coming out of the flooring. But right then, my sister looks up and sees flies. I mean a lot of flies. The hum of the flies was so intense, it felt like it tickled the inside of my ears. Anyway, my sister and I start actively trying to clean the maggots because, gross, right? Right when we start to clean, my mum comes home. She takes one look and her face went pale. I mean, she looked as if she had 0 blood pale. She immediately tells us to open the doors and start praying. She's not saying this calmly either. Needless to say, now my sister and I are terrified. But we do pray, shaking, terrified and crying all the while, hoping it works. We clean the maggots and got all the flies out of the house. All the while, thinking flies in winter? You'd think that's where it would stop that night, right? But no, it doesn't. We do check under the house because it's lifted above ground for the source of the maggots. Absolutely nothing, no reason, and our dogs refuse to go inside their homes, which are placed under the house. The dogs were weary of something under the house. My sister and I go back inside and try to forget about what just happened 10 minutes ago. After a few hours, we eventually fall asleep. I don't remember falling asleep, but I guess I did. For some reason, I wake up having that same feeling of dread. So I sit up and look over, thinking hopefully my sister is awake, when I see something sitting on her back. I could see through it, but it was this black mass that looked like a man, but not a man, like a wolf, mixed with a man. I'm literally shaking. That thing looked like it was choking my sister. I didn't know what else to do but yell at my sister to wake up. My fight or flight apparently was stuck. I'm the worst sister at this moment. No judgment, I was 12. All I could do was scream, "Wake up, Sabrina." After, I'd say about the 3rd or 4th time, all of a sudden, she gasps for air, turns and looks at me, terrified. I asked if she was okay. Then she proceeded to tell me she was having a nightmare. Something that looked like a giant see-through man she couldn't touch was choking her. It was telling her he wanted to make her suffer until he could do the same to me. After she finishes telling me, I told her what I had seen sitting on her. We didn't sleep that night. How could we? I was 12 and she was 14 and both terrified. The next day we sit down to talk to our other 2 sisters, telling them about what happened the night before. After hours of talking, my oldest sister, Samantha, says, "Now all of us have seen it." That terrified me, so I asked what she meant. My 3 older sisters, Samantha, Virginia, and Sabrina, had all seen it before. I had never seen it before. That was the first time. My sisters told me that night, ever since we were sent to live with our mum, they'd been seeing it around her. My sister Virginia then told me, "That's why I don't sleep inside the house with mum. She's creepy. I sleep in the garage." After Virginia said that to Sabrina and myself, we 4 moved our beds into the garage. From there on, we refused to sleep inside the house with my mum. Don't think we were safe in the garage either. Whatever it was still messed with us there too. That was the first time I had seen a black mass, and it was trying to kill my sister. To avoid confusion later on, the house I grew up in looked like a one-story house from the outside, but the downstairs level was underground. It consisted mostly of a living room and a hallway that led to my bedroom on the left and the playroom on the right. When I was a kid, I used to love pretending to be an animal and would often pass the time that way. I don't remember exactly how old I was on this particular night, but I was somewhere between 6 to 8 years old. My parents were watching TV in the living room, and I was off to the side, a few feet away, pretending to be a cat and jumping over the treadmill, then turning around and jumping over it again in the opposite direction. I had done this a few times, and at one point, I had jumped over the treadmill, back to my parents, and facing the hallway. I was about to turn around to jump again, when something caught my eye down the hallway. I saw a shadowy figure run across the hallway from my bedroom into the playroom. He then peeked out at me from the playroom for a moment, before stepping back into the room. As soon as I saw him, I was frozen in place by fear. A sense of dread washed over me, and remained until he stepped back into the playroom. By the silhouette, I could tell the figure was a man wearing a large, wide-brimmed hat and a long trench coat, but that is all the detail I could make out because he appeared to be made of shadow. It was already dark downstairs, with the TV being the main light source, and a light from the kitchen above illuminating the stairs and a small portion of the living room. The hallway was darker, easy enough to see with eyes adjusted to the dim light, but still dark. This shadow man was even darker still. I could very clearly make out the figure as he ran across and then peeked back out at me. I could make out no details of his face or anything else about him, basing my observations entirely on his silhouette because this entity was as black as the void. I saw ghosts frequently when I was young, but if they weren't transparent, then they were just beigeish beings, a streak of something off to my side of my vision for a split second. Even from the more defined apparitions, I never felt fear. They felt different, abnormal, but they were just kind of there. They were no threat. But this shadow man, even from 15 to 20 feet away at the end of the hallway, resulted in such a strong visceral reaction of dread and terror that I had found myself frozen in place until he stepped back into the playroom. Once he did that, the wave of dread passed. I immediately turned around and ran to my parents for comfort. They were both incredibly confused and concerned by how terrified I was. They tried to assure me that nothing bad was down there and that I was safe. I certainly didn't feel safe though. For that night and the few nights after, I refused to sleep in my bedroom. I chose instead to sleep on the couch in the upstairs living room, and during the day I refused to go downstairs alone. My parents didn't know what to do, but after a few days they decided to move their bedroom downstairs into the playroom and to move all my things into the bedroom they'd had upstairs. I think they got the house blessed by someone from church after that. My parents never noticed anything out of the ordinary downstairs, but in the years following, and even now at 32 years old, I only went downstairs when absolutely necessary, and just lived my life in the one story of the house after that. At first, I wouldn't go downstairs alone at all, and was uncomfortable until I went back upstairs. As time went on, I was able to venture downstairs on my own for a few minutes to grab something from storage, but would feel like I was being watched the entire time, and flicked the living room light off at the exact same time as I started running up the stairs. I was braver but still terrified. As an adult, I can now go down there on my own when I visit my parents, but it's still very uncomfortable and I still avoid going downstairs as much as possible. For years after seeing him, I had no idea what or who he was. Just that out of all the strange things I've seen over the years, that he did not mean well and was evil. It wasn't until my teenage years, when everyone started using the internet, that I came across stories from people online describing the exact entity I had seen. I was relieved to know that I wasn't the only one who had seen him, and so I found whatever information I could whenever I could stomach the idea of looking into it. I'd always referred to him as the Shadow Man, but people had taken to calling him the Hat Man online. I saw drawings that looked just like him, though with more details to him than I had seen. They referred to him as a harbinger of doom, or attracted to places with bad energy. When I found this out, I asked my parents if anything bad had happened in the house before he moved in. They told me that, according to neighborhood rumor, the family before us had a son who they kept chained downstairs and abused and tortured him until he died. I could tell my parents weren't joking or making light of the rumors. My mum told me she'd asked the realtor about it after hearing the neighborhood rumors, and found out that it had been true, that a boy had been tortured and abused in our home before my parents bought it. For a long time, that was all I knew, and I just assumed the Hat Man had been drawn to the negative energy surrounding that boy. Years later, I moved out of state, and we alternated between them visiting me and me visiting them. It was just a few years ago, in 2018, when I revisited them and asked more questions about the house. I had been a legal assistant for years by that time, and still am, and had a better idea of how real property documents worked and what my sleuthing skills could uncover. I asked who had the house before us. We looked over the purchase documents and found a name. A bit of Googling later, and I had uncovered the truth about the neighborhood rumors. It turns out they were right in some aspects, but they hadn't known the whole truth. A few families before us, back in the 80s, a family with 2 boys had purchased the house. I found news articles detailing how the elementary school librarian, the same one who still lives near the house even now, had reported to authorities multiple times that the boy, old enough to be in school, was underweight, arrived at school with bruises, and had told teachers, the librarian and others that he was frequently without food. The school even knew it from the parents' own mouths. They told the principal of the elementary school that withholding food was part of the boy's punishment, and forbade the school from providing him food during these punishments. Thankfully, the principal ignored the parents and made sure the boy was fed while he was at school. Apparently that was all they could really do, since multiple reports of child abuse resulted in absolutely nothing being done to protect the boy. After a few years, the family moved to Texas. Once too many people had spoken out against them in my Utah neighborhood. They moved to Texas, where they punished the boy by keeping him chained to a cabinet with a dirty mattress to sleep on, and kept withholding food from him. By the time authorities were called on them in Texas, the people who arrived to investigate found the boy chained to the cabinet, curled up on the mattress, and in a coma. The younger boy was rescued and, from what I could tell from my internet sleuthing, now had a family of his own. The parents, thank goodness, were imprisoned, and still are to this day. So the neighborhood rumors were right about the son of a family who previously lived in our home, who did indeed torture and abuse him. But he didn't die in our house. He died a few years later in Texas. I still do not know if the Hat Man was drawn to the negative energies lingering from when that poor boy lived in our house. I do not know why he showed himself to me, or why he had been in my bedroom and then ran to the playroom across the hall. I don't know why he only showed himself to me that one time, but I could feel something for years after. It does feel like there's something evil downstairs. I just think I'm less sensitive to it now that I'm older. Whatever the sight of him portends, it was a terrifying experience. I never saw him again after that night, but I did feel that sense of dread again. In my teenage years, I experienced sleep paralysis a few times a year. Every time it started, that horrifying, familiar wave of dread passed over me, urging me to move and break out of the paralysis before something really, really bad happened. I learned to focus my willpower on twitching one of my toes. That small twitch of movement was all I needed to break out of the sleep paralysis, but it felt like the most difficult thing to manage while in the middle of the sleep paralysis. I do not know how the Hat Man and the sleep paralysis are related, to be able to elicit the same feeling of overwhelming dread, but I know I was wide awake when I saw the Hat Man. Hello, watchers and listeners. Thank you so much for watching. A huge thank you to all the subscribers who took their time and effort to write out stories for me to read for this one. I still have a few more stories and some more on their way, so expect another subscriber story special in the next month or so. So if you personally have any stories, feel free to send them to me anytime. I'd like to make this a regular thing. If you'd like to help support this channel, there are links to both my Patreon and my Teespring account in the description below. Feel free to check them out. And a huge thank you to those who already do support me on Patreon. And as always, the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. And remember,
Papa loves you.